I join many others in thanking the noble lady Baroness Jenkin for arranging this crucially important debate. It might be useful at the start. You may not be surprised that as a Green I'm standing up to talk about natural resources and biodiversity, but it might be useful for you to know that I also have a background on the international development side of this debate. I spent more than 4 years in Thailand working on a number of UN reports, including on the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women in the late 90s, on women's health and on child labour. So I'm going to begin perhaps by surprising the House by agreeing with the noble Lord Bruce of Venike when he expressed concern that the amount of government aid going to pro-poor funding has gone down. However, where I will disagree with him is that there is any conflict at all between action on the climate emergency and action on helping the poor. What we need, in the jargon, my lords, is a just transition, and that caters to the poor while also looking after the planet. And I was speaking at the weekend at a debate with a young campaigner from the 1010 organisation, and she used a very memorable phrase that you don't fix the problems we have now with the system that created them. And the fact is, fossil fuel societies have created a deeply unequal world in which many are suffering from the kind of poverty, the kind of hunger that many noble lords have referred to. Many will be familiar with the term resource curse. Even countries that have lots of resources, fossil fuels, and indeed those of other minerals, the poor have suffered and not benefited from them. So I believe for the poor of the world, the fact that we can now do without fossil fuels is something to celebrate. That, however, is not the direction being taken by Britain's international aid effort. The Environmental Audit Committee has focused on the fact that the UK Export Finance has put £2.5 billion in the last 5 years into fossil fuel finance. Now, there's a phrase that's really important in this context: lock in. You build that infrastructure, you have locked in potential emissions for many years to come, and if you stop those emissions, you've actually wasted huge amounts of money and left people trapped. Now, I would refer the Labour Minister, and I'd be happy to provide her with the reference to a report from Dr. Chris Smith from the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds. And this was in Nature Communications in January 2018. And it's a very important, I believe, hopeful report, because it stresses that if we, at the end of 2018, had stopped investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure all around the world, we can just, using the existing infrastructure, come in under 1.5. Ending new fossil fuel infrastructure is crucial, so we as the UK should not be funding this. Now, I want to turn a little to the area of my particular passion in terms of food and agriculture. Now, looking at the UK's efforts in this area, there's a programme called Building Resilience and Adaptation to Climate Extremes and Disasters. And it says that it plans to use the techniques of climate-smart agriculture. Now, that's something I would like to ask the Minister to reconsider, to think about very hard. Because, first of all, the term climate-smart agriculture has no definitional meaning. There is no classification system, as there is, for example, like organic agriculture I was talking about earlier. But I think most people who are propounding climate-smart agriculture would agree that what it means is essentially doing the kind of farming we do now, but doing it much more efficiently. Now, I'm going to agree here with the noble Lord Cameron, referring to the importance of no-till and minimum till. What we have to make sure is that UK aid efforts, and indeed I refer to the words of the Right Reverend Prelate earlier, we have trashed our own soils. Our farming methods have done great damage. We have to make sure that we are not exporting these with our aid efforts. Now, one of the other programs that our UK aid effort is going into is funding an organisation called AgDevCo. And I was looking up the kind of things, the projects that it's supporting. Now, the noble Lord Hope, referred to palm oil plantations and the kind of damage they're doing. This organisation is supporting palm oil plantations and cashew nuts. It's supporting macadamia exports and avocado growers in Kenya. It's supporting the Ugandan coffee sector. These are traditional export-orientated, high-input, deeply damaging forms of agriculture. I would applaud what Lord German referred to in terms of the keyhole gardens, the kind of permaculture-based agroecological approaches that have to be the future to provide for the poor, to provide food security, to provide security for all of us in a stable planet. Now, the debate talks about biodiversity, and I think most people have referred to the idea of natural wild biodiversity. But I do just very briefly want to mention the importance of crop biodiversity, because 20% of human calories come from one crop, wheat. In terms of food security, that's incredibly dangerous, and it also means one of the noble lords made a reference to giant industrial-scale monoculture, huge fields of identical crops, which cannot be the biological future for this planet. So, just also on that crop biodiversity, just briefly, we are also talking here about human health. I'm going to refer to another study from Tanzania in ecological economics, which looked at how crop diversity fed into the health of children. And children, perhaps unsurprisingly, who had a more diverse diet were healthier. And this effect was most evident for subsistence farming households and for children in households with limited market access. This is the kind of agriculture we need to be supporting. Now, I just very briefly going to address the question. Oh, sorry.
I'm very grateful to you. I'm very interested by this part of her speech, which I must say reminds me of a great deal of my own work in Africa in the past. Would she not agree that one of the episodes in history, periods in history, at which we have to look very critically to see what we can learn, is the promotion of top-down cash crops, when in fact local communities were having very self-sustaining systems themselves, which were exactly what we now realize we need. The great lessons to be learned there, I think she would also possibly agree that it's not a matter of lecturing the third world on what they must do, it's a matter of setting examples ourselves.
I would entirely agree with everything the noble lord just said, and I think your lordship's house is likely to hear me referring often to the importance of strong local economies in which a large amount of food on the plate comes from within, not very far away, and that I think is true around the world. And we're talking about the aid effort here. What we want to do is support and help people to develop and work on their own local systems. Now, I just very briefly, because the noble Lord, Lord Bruce, and I think Lord Cameron also, raised the issue of population. And this is a statement I hear often, why are we not talking about population? Well, I would say that we're looking, in terms of the IPCC, saying we have 11 years to turn our planet around. Now, the human ecological footprint is a product, this is an equation, of the number of people on the planet multiplied by their consumption levels. The number of people on the planet will not change very significantly in the next 12 years. What we have to change is the consumption levels, particularly the consumption levels of societies like Britain, where we're using our share of the resources of 3 planets every year, yet we only have 1. However, if we're going to talk about international aid going into women's rights to control their own body, to have access to contraceptives, to abortion, to economic opportunities and education, then perhaps we could find some points of agreement on that. Finally, I'm aware I have taken quite a bit of time, but I think the noble lady introducing this debate made a really important point that I want to come back to, because I think it should be highlighted and should be the takeaway message from this debate. She, I think, asked the Minister, should, with our aid, we first do no harm? And that is a very important question to ask, and I think should surely only be answered in the affirmative. So we cannot afford the harm of funding new fossil fuel infrastructure. We cannot afford the harm of funding, supporting, encouraging sorts of agriculture that trash the planet and fail to provide food security. We cannot afford to be supporting agriculture that's growing crops to be fed to animals in industrial agriculture. That is food waste, which I think this House would generally agree with me that food waste is a bad thing. So I guess the simple question I'd like to leave the noble lady, the Minister, is please can you, whatever role you might be playing in the future after the election, be working on